Unlocking central control and potential pawn chains, it prepares to develop pieces efficiently. Immediately establishing central presence mirrors white's intention, fostering a symmetrical pawn structure ripe for future strategic clashes. Initiating central pressure, this move contests black's pawn and aims for immediate queenside space. Solidifying the center and opening lines for the bishop, this prepares for development without immediate pawn skirmishes. Developing the knight here aims to control central squares and prepare for kingside castling. Developing the bishop harmoniously, preparing kingside castling and reinforcing the d5 pawn's defense. Developing knights early is key to controlling central squares and preparing for castling. Developing the knight to a central square, this piece now supports pawn breaks and eyes the queenside. Opening the center, white seeks active piece play and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure. Recapturing here opens the e-file for your rook, preparing for central development and potential pressure. Developing the bishop here pins the knight, creating pressure on black's center and potentially preparing a queenside expansion later. Solidifying the pawn chain, black prepares to develop pieces behind its sturdy structure. Securing the queen on this central square, prepares to launch an attack on black's pawn chain. Shaping the queenside structure with fianchetto opens diagonal lines, but neglects central pawn support. Unleashing central pawns, white initiates a bold pawn thrust to seize space and disrupt black's pawn structure. Relinquishing central pawn control now opens lines, but careful piece placement is paramount to avoid positional weaknesses. Exchanging the bishop immediately disrupts black's pawn structure and opens lines toward the weakened kingside. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop solidifies black's pawn structure, though it sacrifices a tempo for piece development. Capturing the pawn opens a vital diagonal for the queen and threatens immediate exposure of the black king. Reclaiming the attacked bishop reestablishes piece harmony, preventing immediate kingside worries. Targeting the weak squares around black's king, this bishop now claims a commanding diagonal. Prioritizing development and queen activity, black aims to connect rooks and challenge white's imposing bishop. Exchanging on e6 clears the d-file for pressure and opens a diagonal for your queen. Recapturing with the queen now reclaims central space and aims to disrupt white's pawn structure, though the king feels a touch exposed. Trading queens here simplifies the position, ushering in an endgame where king activity will become paramount. The doubled pawns now define black's central structure, a potential long-term weakness to exploit in the coming endgame. Opening the knight to the central square initiates pressure and prepares for potential pawn pushes, aiming to exploit black's somewhat weakened kingside pawn structure. Securing the king's passage to safer territory, this defensive maneuver prepares to activate the monarch and counter white's imposing central presence. Initiating a powerful queenside expansion by embracing the open c-file, aiming to dismantle black's pawn structure and expose the castled king. A bold knight maneuver aiming to occupy the potentially open c-file and prepare for active piece play on the queenside. Pushing pawns forward on the kingside creates space for the knight and prepares to advance it, though it also exposes the king slightly. Developing the bishop to g7 is a flexible choice, preparing to defend the kingside and potentially support a pawn push on the h-file. Unleashing a pawn storm to fracture black's king defenses and seize the h-file is a bold, aggressive intent. Opening the kingside file with this capture, black accepts a slightly compromised pawn structure, aiming to trade down and simplify towards a manageable endgame. Reclaiming the pawn, the rook now becomes a formidable force, aggressively targeting the weakened kingside. This solidifies black's central presence, preparing to contest the d-file and activate their rook. Seizing the open file with the knight creates immediate attacking potential and pressures black's weakened kingside pawn structure. A bold knight sortie aims to disrupt white's central control and exploit the open lines, creating dynamic counterplay. Sharpening the pawn chain forces black's knight to a passive square, preparing to exploit the open files. Navigating the knight to d5 aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and contest the open files. Concentrating forces on the kingside, this move immediately pressures black's pawn structure and threatens kingside expansion. A bold counterthrust, challenging the pawn chain and seeking to disrupt white's rook on the open file. Sacrificing the exchange opens a decisive diagonal for the queen, aiming to dismantle black's weak pawn structure around the king. Sacrificing material to open files for a decisive assault on the beleaguered king. Securing the open file decisively transforms the landscape, creating an immediate advantage on the board. Safeguarding the monarch from the looming threats on the open files is paramount now, establishing a more secure defensive posture. Unleashing a knight's power to control the critical 5th rank and threaten black's exposed king. Seizing the open file to threaten the d-pawn offers a tactical opportunity for counterplay in a complex queenside structure. Unleashing a knight's fork, white snatches the rook and forces a decisive material advantage. Capturing the knight concedes crucial central control, simplifying into a potentially losing endgame for black. Seizing the initiative, white sacrifices a knight to dismantle black's pawn structure and expose the king. King's desperate retreat exposes it to devastating discovered attacks and impending mate. The knight's capture dramatically simplifies the position, creating an immediate material imbalance and opening lines toward the exposed black king. A desperate king scramble, hoping the passed pawn won't decide the game. A swift king hunt culminates, simplifying into a swift material advantage. Accepting the rook sacrifice solidifies your material advantage, yet leaves your king exposed to the newly opened diagonal. Securing the king's pawn advance aims to exploit the open files and create space for attacking. Seeking counterplay, black's king abandons its safe haven to potentially disrupt white's queenside consolidation. Securing the central pawns with f4 is a vital step to restrict black's king activity and solidify white's advantage. Proactively seizing the open c-file with the pawn establishes a vital pathway for future piece activity. Securing the queenside majority with this knight outpost promises long-term pressure. Opening the kingside pawns to create an escape route for the monarch, this pawn advance challenges the knight and prepares to advance further down the board. Asserting dominance on the central d-file now allows white to orchestrate a powerful king hunt. Securing the queenside pawn chain stability against further white inroads becomes paramount here. The monarch ventures forth, seeking safety from the open files and potential pawn breakthroughs. Opening the king's diagonal for potential escape or counterplay, while aiming to consolidate the knight. Consolidating the king towards the center now prepares for pawn advances, eyeing potential breakthroughs. The black king, now unchained from its previous defensive post, seeks a more active role in the unfolding pawn structure battle. Repositioning the knight to a central outpost significantly strengthens white's grip on the board. The black king exposed is now a prime target as the white knight prepares to skewer the passed pawn. Opening the queenside now aims to restrict black's knight and create a passer. Initiating development of the knight to a more active central square, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create counterplay. King escape route choked, forcing further pawn concessions or retreat. King's safety is now paramount, as the monarch retreats further into a passive position with this passive repositioning. Centralizing the knight on e8 creates a formidable blockade, tying down black's passive pieces. Relocating the monarch to safety becomes paramount, as the queens have departed the board. Unleashing a forceful knight check to disrupt the opposing king's already precarious safety. The king is exposed by the pawn advance, creating a dynamic imbalance in this endgame. The knight retreats, anticipating a breakthrough on the king's weakened pawn shield. The king's journey now continues into the center, seeking respite from the impending knight outpost. A forcing check, aiming to disrupt the enemy king's rest and exploit the open nature of the board. Forcing the same position again shows a lack of constructive ideas, allowing white to simply repeat and avoid any potential tactical risks. Repositioning the knight to a more active square will disrupt black's defensive setup. Aggressively pushing the king forward might overextend it, inviting potential weaknesses. The knight repositions, aiming to support a potential pawn push or find a more active square. Knight boldly ventures to d4, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and seek activity on the queen side. The king embarks on a risky central march, seeking activity despite the pawn structure. A final desperate attempt to generate counterplay with the king, but the pawn structure remains too weak. This knight repositions, eyeing squares that will exploit black's advanced pawns. Gaining an outpost on the c2 square allows the knight to exert pressure along the c-file and potentially fork pieces. Pushing the king forward offers a chance to blockade the central pawns and coordinate the remaining forces for a decisive attack. A desperate attempt to disrupt white's approaching king, but this knight's sortie leads to its inevitable demise, sacrificing material for little gain. King centralization becomes paramount, anchoring your forces and preparing to advance that queenside pawn. Seeking escape, the knight endeavors to harass white's monarchs through a dizzying dance. The knight repositions, ready to exploit the weak pawn structure and create new threats. Gaining a tempo with the knight forces the king to shuffle, but it doesn't solve the fundamental issue of the isolated passed pawn. Securing the king's escape route while preparing to advance the pawns signifies a shift towards a winning endgame. Confronting the king's exposed position, this retreat seeks to avoid immediate capture and regroup before the inevitable endgame. Pressing the knight to c4 aims to dislodge the troublesome knight on d4 and prepare for future pawn advances. Seizing initiative on the queen side, a bold counterattack challenging the advanced knight and forcing positional concessions. Securing the central pawn chain's advance, this thrust breaks open lines for your rook. This pawn push opens a diagonal for the knight and tries to break through white's position. The knight's repositioning hints at a potential kingside infiltration, leveraging the pawn structure. The knight's journey to capture that pawn offers a fleeting glimmer of counterplay, but white's dominant pawn structure is already too well entrenched to be troubled. Unleashing a king-hunting pawn aims to shatter black's defensive pawn chain, opening lines for your remaining pieces. Escaping the discovered check, the black king must navigate a treacherous endgame where pawns become weapons. Unleashing a kingside pawn storm, white forces the black monarch into a precarious, exposed position. The black king awkwardly shuffles, still exposed and lacking crucial pawn protection in this advanced stage. Sacrificing tempo to draw the king into a more exposed position. Initiating a desperate blockade to prevent the white king's advance, though the knight's position looks isolated. Unleashing a pawn creates a decisive outpost for the white king, forcing further concessions. Unleashing the knight to the queenside offers black a flicker of counterplay. Fulfilling the king's role in this pawn race, pushing it forward to support the upcoming breakthrough. This knight repositions to a more active square, ready to support potential advances or disrupt white's pawn structure. Unleashing the pawn's final journey offers a decisive path to victory, leveraging its advanced position to secure the win.